Okay, thank you very much for coming to our session. Our session is on procedural key performance indicators, PKPIs, for assessing global ocean equity. It is presented by Ocean Nexus. I'm the director, and we'd like to thank United Nations Oceans to host our event, side event, and we to introduce Ocean Nexus very proudly as a collaboration between Nippon Foundation. So thanks for the Nippon Foundation, and also Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus Center at University of Washington in Seattle, United States. This event is composed of 11 presentations. It's a lot going on, but I like to start by introducing our biggest collaborator, Mr. Yohei Sasakawa, the chairman of the Nippon Foundation. The chairman kindly sent us a video message, so I'm just going to play it now. There's one technical thing. Chairman wanted to put the subtitle in his presentation just to care about the inclusiveness, but unfortunately for the technical difficulties, we couldn't do that. But I just wanted to convey his care about inclusion and equity. So Leah, our community officer, can you actually start showing a video message from Chairman Yohei Sasakawa, please?
Hello, everyone. Blue Ocean and my blue suits. I'd like to thank all of you for participating in this online event with such passion and interest. Perhaps too many of us still hold to the idea of free use of the oceans, which was advocated by Grotius in the 17th century. However, as you know, the ocean is in a global crisis. For more than 30 years, the Nippon Foundation has taken seriously the silent screams of our Mother Ocean, the source of all life, and has been working to protect the ocean. Our work has been diverse, from human capacity building, countermeasures against marine litter, and support towards Pacific Island countries. As part of these efforts to protect our Mother Ocean, the Nexus program took on the grand theme of predicting the future of the oceans in 2011. From then to 2019, the program produced remarkable results, including the nurturing of numerous research fellows and the publication of hundreds of academic papers. In the course of these efforts, it became clear that the social systems which had sustained the marine environment and ecosystems for generations through equitable ocean access and use was also under threat. Armed with these insights, the Ocean Nexus program was launched in 2019. More than 300 like-minded researchers have already joined us to work toward the far-reaching goal of achieving a just and equitable ocean. Despite the ongoing pandemic, we are proud of the diverse network we helped to create, and I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to all of the participating researchers for their efforts. I look forward learning about all of the latest research results from the NF Ocean Nexus program in this side event. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Chairman. It was great to have a message from him. There's one thing he said: we helped to create the network, but I must say, Nippon Foundation is part of networks, and we're proud to be working together with them. So now, so again, my name is Dr. Yoshitaka Yoshi-Ota. I'm a director of Ocean Nexus, and I'm also a professor of practice at the University of Washington School of Marine and Environmental Affairs. So the first of all, to start with, can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is our menu today. It's a lot going on. You don't have to understand everything about it, but you really have to get the gist of what we are presenting, hopefully for the next hour and a half. We have introduction done, and I'm going to present the overview, and from Andrés Cisneros-Montemayor will present baseline of our studies, and from there, Dr. Timothy Clark, Dr. Jessica Vandenberg, next page, please. Dr. Leah Fusco, Dr. Marleen Schutter, Dr. Annie Yong-Song, Dr. Hekia Bodwitch, Dr. Annet and Dr. Rebeca Kalman will present different case studies from different parts of the world and to talk about what the PKPI is. I'm still getting used to this term. And Dr. Derosine will introduce assessment format and of assessment framework of PKPI. But please do stay through the event so you really can understand what PKPI is. And we're going to ask our great scholar of the practice friends, Ms. Angelique Pompano, Dr. Cinda Scott, and Dr. Maria Epistemic to actually give a comment of what they think about the PKPI. Is it useful? So that's all our menu. Now, can you go to the next slide, please? So just quickly about what Ocean Nexus is. This is our Ocean Network, Ocean Nexus network presenting. And Ocean Nexus is, our mission is to transform ocean governance to tackle systemic inequalities through action-based research. Our members and friends, a diverse group of international interdisciplinary scholars and practitioners whose work center equity and justice. And then I don't think there's clear boundary between what the scholar and the practitioners, we all are scholars, including the chairman, whoever modest learner. And our annual budget is 3.2 million, a 10 years commitment by Nippon Foundation. It makes total of 32 million for the 10 years program. And our program office is at the Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus Center, which is in University of Washington, Seattle. But our shared leadership, I'm a director, but I'm shared the leadership together with our deputy directors and even the fellows. But our deputy directors are with partner institutes, including Simon Fraser University, Dalhousie University, University of Victoria, and Edinburgh University. So that's what the Ocean Nexus is. If you'd like to learn more about it, please come to our Ocean Nexus Center's website, which is going to be on the chat. Thank you, Leah. Can you go to the next slide, please? So I'm going to give an overview of procedural key performance indicators. What it is, why procedural, what are we trying to do, how different that is. That's what I'm going to talk about in about like 10 minutes. So if there's any question or anything, you can just always ask in the chat. We may not be able to address it in time, but we're trying to address it later. If anybody's interested in, again, come to the Nexus website. Okay, let's start. What is this new indicators that we're trying to put? So first of all, why and what are PKPI, procedural key performance indicators? So many indicators out there. Do we need the new one? So our claim is sustainable development for oceans demand societal outcomes. That's our mandate. Leave no one behind, co-benefit with other targets and goals for the sustainable development, to connect it, link it, but finally it is really for the society. So sustainable development for the oceans really demands societal outcomes. However, current indicators for oceans are not really directly reflecting systemic issues at the heart of societal inequity and inequalities. We kind of tend to separate between ocean and society, and not really addressing so much about the relationship between the two. And in many places and many worldviews, they're connected. And so how can we actually address societal outcomes, what it is, and how do we actually see the progress of any of the sustainable development oceans effort to address societal outcomes? We need new indicators. So PKPI, procedural key performance indicators that we are trying to propose, are contextual and critical aspects needed to highlight society inequities and inequalities. And then we're going to reveal what they are, what kind of aspects are we talking about in our case studies, and also potentially discuss more on the panel. And so our PKPIs, this is a very important point, indicates, what does it indicate? If and how ocean policy and intervention contributes to bringing an end to systemic inequity and inequality. And then I can already hear saying like, why do we do beyond the ocean? Because we believe that's what ocean intervention and policy could actually contribute. And we also believe that's what we like to see, an end to systemic inequality and inequity. And there's no doubt about us as a long and devoted scholars of the network shouldn't try this aim. So there you go, PKPIs contribute to bringing an end. Thank you for the next slide. And so the aim is first to avoid unintended consequences and unjust outcomes from ocean policy and interventions. Ocean Nexus is a large network, both natural and social scientists, but we also have a lot of social scientists working on these issues. So, when societal outcomes involved, it's behavior, it's human, we have our intended consequences, but we believe it can be avoided by learning what the critical aspects we have to address. Okay, second, we like to achieve beyond the norm of do no harm. In this climate, I'm wearing this shirt, the extreme heat is hitting Pacific Northwest in the United States. I bother not to wear the jacket because this is a reality. And the reality is also wonderfully United Stations at home. So we don't really think do no harm is good enough. We want to go beyond that for environment, for society, and for our intergenerational equity. So we're going for more do no harm attitude and aim. And also to facilitate the engagement of the scientists and the practitioners with social equity and justice. When social comes up, some natural scientists, I think they're like, I'm really focusing on this very environmental and natural science aspect of it, but also they have an identity, cultural identity, social identity, was really strong on engaging equity and justice. We like to honor that, and we like to invite those colleagues to work with us. So really to facilitate engagement of scientists and practitioners. Next slide, please. Okay, so the journey of PKPI, where does it come from? So the first of all, this is the model. Okay, we have overfishing, and SDG outcomes is a sustainable fishery, blue economy, which is equity and economic viability and environmental sustainability together, yeah? So, and climate mitigation adaptation, zero waste or clean ocean, and then social responsible seafood supply chain. I'm actually quoting Jack Killinger. So the problems on the right hand, left hand, and SDG outcomes on right. So this is the journey we'd like to have for the SDG development effort. However, to the next slide, we need to have societal outcomes. For the societal outcomes, we're looking, there's a missing link. That is equity considerations. We need to consider food sovereignty, colonial legacy, climate justice, corporate responsibility and governance, and gender intersectionality, many more between problems and then SDG outcomes. And this is a procedural approach to it, and equity approach to it. But what we are bringing as a new model It's the next slide, please. It's really to put societal outcome as an outcome together with the SDG outcome. Not equal, we are thinking SDG outcomes also can bring or can contribute towards those societal outcomes, and it should. So indigenous sovereignty, climate justice, anti-hegemony, West decolonization, corporate governance, labor solidarity and empowerment, anti-gender intersectionality discrimination, and I put it bold, and anti-racism. We really think this is a new model that we wanted to go for to prioritize societal outcomes in our ocean interventions and the policy. Can you go next, please? Okay, so what do we mean by the procedural? It's just simple. Normative approach is we got trying to see the categorical socioeconomic benefit. Socioeconomic, environment, social, cultural, and the cultural usually commoditized. If you know, just some sort of like a photo, you take it on and then put it on the Twitter or social media. I mean, that's not really cultural, but sometimes that becomes kind of like a, quantitative data. Demographic, health, nutrition, those really to achieve from the Ocean Initiative and the policies to seek for it is the approach for the societal outcomes. What we are saying is a bit different. Can you go next slide? What we are saying is let's really address and societal outcomes. Let's really take societal outcome approach, which basically means let's address underlying systemic issues: political power, race, ethnicity, gender, class, colonial legacies, narrative, well-being, worldviews. Things we kind of like right there, but we don't really talk about it because we tend to think that's not ocean, but that is an ocean. And then that elephant in the room needs to be talked about, needs to be addressed as we actually take the procedure to design, implement, manage, monitor any ocean initiative and the policies. Next slide, please. So our PKPI is process-based assessment, not prescribed checklist. It's not one go. And we are integrating qualitative data, story, and the memories. And then you think that's not number, that can be a number. And then that also is very strong heart of what we need to care for. Any recent event, if you're engaging with the reality of this world right now, these are very important.
Okay. And third, evolving. This is evolving and then adaptive and then contextual indicators, not a snapshot measurement. So, unfortunately, you need to engage with us continuously. So the next one, please. So how are we going to operationalize? We're going to connect the research policy partnership. For research, identify systemic issues related to marine environment, resource use, conservation, development, and community engagement. Okay, what do we mean? What are you talking about? Systemic issues. It's very contextual, but we need to identify it. That's what the research should do. And policy and governance, and then that's explore policy and governance options to directly address systemic issues. Which options are directly addressing systemic issues? And in partnership, we need to co-design performance assessment and a future strategy or current strategy together with real stakeholders, the people engaging in ocean governance, and the people also working and together with ocean and really on the community side. And then that's what we are really hoping to make a partnership as a co-design partner. So we need to connect research policy partnership and then hoping, we are making Ocean Nexus as this platform of the research. We are research platform. The real change has to be on the ground. Next one, please. So through this, our framework of a PKPI, our platform, research platform of the PKPI, we don't want to steal any platform from anybody else. People have been working on ocean equity and justice long time. We are just research platform, but through this research platform for PKPI, we seek to procedural direction for ocean justice.
Can you go next one, please? Okay, and so our PKPI demands accountability transparency, and legitimacy for ocean initiatives if you are claiming you're working for the equity and justice. Next one, please. So today, I'm going to introduce my fellow colleagues and highlight research part of the case studies of ocean equity. And then also a couple of colleagues are going to show what the policy analysis is and then what sort of like assessment framework we can co-design. And then those are the last two presentations. And lastly, I'd like to announce, I'd like to state that we have a partnership also together with the Ocean Voices. That's another program directed by Dr. Harry Harden Davis. And it just had an announcement previously with Alliance of Small Island States together with Nippon Foundation for the new capacity building approach. And we also like to say, we also partnership, I'm sorry, One Ocean Hub, which is having an event tomorrow, and One Ocean Hub is an academic network directed by Dr. Professor Elisa Mongera. So that's our menu today. That was an overview of the PKPI, and I'm sure you're still in a great model event, but as you hear the research case studies from our fellows, it will be much more clearer. And remember, this is evolving things, and we like to have a partnership together working. And I just wanted to say thank you very much for coming to the event. Please stay until the end. Go for the next slide, please. Okay, now I'm going to introduce Dr. Cisneros-Montemayor, and he's a resource economist interested in coastal poverty alleviation and food sovereignty. And his work has covered various themes, including ecotourism, marine protected areas, small-scale fisheries, so on and so forth. My God, Andrés, you did a lot. And his current focus is on blue economy. And he's a deputy director of the Ocean Nexus, as well as professor at Simon Fraser University in Canada. The work he's presenting is based on his paper published in Nature last year, and which recently won the best research article for sustainable development research. Congratulations, Dr. Cisneros-Montemayor, and please do take it over.
Thank you so much, Yoshi, and hi everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's really exciting to be showing this work. I mean, as Yoshi have said, we've collectively in the program, we worked on so many things over the years, and it's really great to be at this point where we're building the foundations and really getting more into that actionable parts of our research, even as we continue to do all these academic things. So today, I'm just going to kind of set the stage a little bit for really the meat of the presentation, which will be the fellows presenting in a second. Trying to see if this remote clicker works. Oh, there we go. And as you mentioned, some of the work that we've done on blue economy has really tried to integrate the social and the economic aspects as best we can. But before I get into that, and this will be very brief, I really want to sort of define what we mean by blue economy, because the term has now come to be used in many different ways by many different actors in the ocean policy space. And so when we're talking about blue economy, we're thinking of ocean resource-based sectors that are socially equitable, environmentally sustainable, and economically viable. It has to have those three things. And really that focus on social equity is what makes blue economy a new and transformative development model. We often think about ocean development in terms of finding resources, finding where we can establish new sectors. For a long time now, we've been very much aware that ecological sustainability is a key part of ocean development. But that focus on social equity and making sure that we have equitable sectors, in addition to just sustainable ones, is what makes blue economy something new and something that's exciting for people to work on, and sorely needed, I might add. Now, the question that becomes, do we have the capacity to establish a blue economy? And again, not just in terms of finding where resources are, that'll come with better technologies and with better knowledge, but making these sectors equitable and sustainable and economically viable, of course. And so what we've tried to do is take a range of indicators from social sciences and natural sciences and integrate them in a way that allows us to answer this question of capacity. I'm not going to go into methods here. I'm more than happy to have other conversations if you reach out to me. But the findings of this, when we put everything together, are that, first of all, in terms of the resources, which is what most people intuitively focus on when we're thinking about ocean development, all nations have natural resources for a lot, but not all ocean sectors. And the vast majority of those resources are going to be along the coastlines that already have really long traditions of users and activities and a lot of values associated with those traditional activities. And so it's really important to think about that, because often when we hear different narratives of blue economy, the narratives are of an ocean that's empty, essentially a blank slate to power a new industrial revolution, when really what we have are a huge amount of resources that are right along the coastlines where people already are. And so we're going to have to be very, very careful in terms of how we choose and how we develop those resources into new sectors. And secondly, the enabling conditions that we need to turn those ocean resources into blue economies, again, ones that are equitable and sustainable and viable, those enabling conditions are much more unevenly dispersed throughout the world. And that's where the key challenges are that we're going to have to address. And so the essential lesson from all this are that global blue economy models show us that global models can't ensure that people benefit equitably from ocean sectors. And so that's why, even though we can have guidance and we can inform decisions based on large data sets, ultimately the solutions have to be developed locally and in context. And that's a lot of what you're going to hear in the forthcoming talks. Thank you very much. And I'll hand it back to Yoshi.
Thank you very much, Andrés. And it's really great to have sort of like an overview and, just pointed out the blue economy is really those three wings, and what was an enabling condition and resource and economic viability is we can cover. So now we're going to go on to the case studies of the PKPI. And I'm sort of grateful to present Dr. Timothy Clark, and who's a historical sociologist interested in a political economy of development. And his work explores how kind of like social inequity and inequality and even economic accumulations are historically intertwined with unsustainable ecological outcomes. So it really starts from the history. And he's currently a postdoc with Ocean Nexus in Simon Fraser University, collaborating with Dr. Cisneros-Montemayor. And also he's an incoming assistant professor of environmental sociology at Catawba College, North Carolina. So if you wanted to find him afterwards, please click his name and Catawba College in North Carolina. Tim, please take it away.
Okay, just one sec.
Take your time.
All right. So good day, everyone. Today I'll be discussing the U.S. Atlantic Menhaden fishery in regards to recognitional equity. I'm going to be stressing the importance of historical context as well for improving project design and recognitional equity. So first, just a little bit of background on the U.S. Atlantic Menhaden fishery. It is the country's oldest ongoing industrial scale fishery. It reached its economic zenith during the mid-20th century, when it was predominantly a southern mid-Atlantic fishery. Since then, it has largely been in decline, which has accelerated through the 21st century. Indeed, the fishery over the last several decades has suffered continuous and precipitous economic decline, as well as decline in its geographic range, with little sign of recovery. So here you see just one iteration of this decline. Boat vessels and factories where the menhaden was processed into agricultural commodities like fertilizer. These means of production have been in decline clearly since the 1950s. But if you were to look at other indicators like fish catch or employment or ownership stakes, you would see similar trends. So, and in analyzing this case, I generally sought to explore the fisheries developmental history. Let's see here. Yeah, we're still on analysis. Okay. Using historical archive data, including 30 interviews with fishers and captains, as well as sea songs or chanties sung by fishers at sea. This was predominantly my primary source of data. I also utilized secondary historical data, media insights as well, or media reports and articles from the relevant time periods. So I use this historical data to construct comparable narratives across periods in order to uncover the social and political economic factors that meaningfully drove development and unsustainable processes in the fishery over time. So this analysis revealed the importance for a racialized class hierarchy for both the prosperity and the eventual decline of the fishery. In the mid-20th century, at the fishery's economic zenith or high point, Black workers occupied roughly 90% of the fishery's workforce. Black workers in the fishery occupied the most physically dangerous, taxing positions, also lowest status, most precarious, and lowest paid. So archived interviews and media sources revealed some important findings related to recognitional inequality within this fishery. So first, I'll stress that Black workers made political demands for better working conditions and better recognition and for many years at the fishery's zenith. There's a good record of this. However, these efforts were labeled a communist plot by white investors, received community backlash, and ultimately were politically crushed. Furthermore, in the records, Black workers were characterized by media and fishery elites as being inherently or naturally suited to perform more physically intensive labor. Black workers were often described as being in their place or even lucky to have what jobs they did have. This racist reproduction of class hierarchy made it that much more difficult, if not structurally impossible, to recognize the political, social goals and visions of Black workers, which again constituted the vast majority of these fishing communities. Ultimately, this recognitional inequality also made it that much more difficult to sustain the fishery, as the fishery ultimately was composed of African Americans. It is difficult to sustain what we do not value, and it is difficult to value what we do not recognize. So obviously we cannot go back in time, but we can draw lessons from this case for thinking about communities, development, and sustainability and various aspects of equity in the process. So one thing I would like to emphasize is the importance of doing what critical historians and specifically some critical maritime historians refer to as history from below. History from below encourages the researcher to seek out data from marginalized working class or generally, the non kind of famous stereotypical drivers of history. Therefore, it views developmental context from a bottom-up lens that people make history. People do history and development. Thus, people are history makers capable of social and political world making, social thought, and philosophical cultural knowledge making that is essential for understanding historical and developmental contexts. So practically speaking, this encourages us to widen our perspective of what counts as data, to gain context and recognize the goals, values, perspectives of traditionally historically marginalized groups. It is useful, therefore, to consider folklore, art, poetry, song, political speech as sources of socio-historical data. So in my case, in utilizing, for example, the sea songs or chanties sung by Black workers while at sea, I was able to learn more about how Black workers satirized the fishery's power structure, express their hopes to provide for their families, come home safe, and generally denaturalize the social hierarchies that existed within the fisheries for many years. So doing this kind of historicizing is just one necessary step towards improving the design process. In history from below, the researcher gains a better sense of the historical context of a community and how recognitional inequality has been maintained and reproduced over time. So I believe that this is, again, one essential step towards improving how we as researchers and project managers can work to ameliorate developmental inequalities in such a way that demarginalizes groups of people whose goals and visions are too often unrecognized in the historical and social context. So thank you for your time, and I'll pass it off to the next person.
Thank you very much, Tim. Tim, so if you're going to say your PKPI is, PKPI for any policy intervention from your work is probably if and how the policy intervention and the design looked at history from below. Does it actually reflect what you talked about quite quickly? Just yes and no would be fine.
Well, I think yes, I think yeah.
I forced you into
it. One important way to incorporate the historical community level context necessary for research design or project design. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Dr. Clark. And now I'm moving to Dr. Jessica Vandenberg. Dr. Jessica Vandenberg is a cultural anthropologist who's an Ocean Nexus postdoc at the University of Washington, and her work covers intersection between social organization and marine conservation and marine issues. She's very passionate about equity and justice and really engaging with action research. And she's currently focused on marine plastic pollution, as well as the works related to marine conservation and narratives. Today, she's presenting her work from Indonesian community. Yeah, and so Jessica, please start.
Thank you, Yoshi, for the introduction, and thank you for having me today. So today I'll be discussing one of my case studies, which is a coral restoration program based in a small island community in the Sparamundi Islands of Indonesia. And this program is posed as a win-win conservation development initiative aimed at restoring local coral reef ecosystems and fishery production, in turn improving local food security. It is also part of a broader corporate social responsibility program and is implemented by a large multinational corporation that sources fish from Indonesia. In the next slides, I'll describe various historical, political, and cultural contexts that were neglected in the project, leading to social inequities and unmet societal outcomes. Through these examples, I hope to highlight how factors that are often assumed to be outside the immediate scope of a conservation project in actuality matter and have enormous influence. The Sparamundies have been influenced by foreign involvement since the 16th century, beginning with the opening of the European spice trade, followed by Dutch colonialism. After Indonesia gained its independence, this region was impacted by a series of economic crises, religious and ethnic persecutions, and neoliberal exploitation. And many of these historical events impacted when people have moved to and from the Sparamundi and how they perceive foreign development and conservation interventions. In the case of the restoration program, the intervention triggered fears of future dispossession and concerns over the company's motivations for engaging in reef restoration on the reefs surrounding the community. Seeing coral restoration infrastructure anchored to the seafloor, community members feared that the transactional nature of receiving payment for participation was in actuality a transaction of money for seafloor territory. The second example is related to the socio-political context of the community and how existing power dynamics presented barriers to accessing potential food security benefits of coral restoration. Most community members in this community are involved in a pelagic fishery, and one of the defining characteristics of this fishery is its patron-client structure, where Punggawa, which is the local term for a patron, provides fishing gear, boats, access to markets, and loans to their sawi, which is the local term for a fisherman or crew member. And Punggawa are described as important community leaders, displaying strong reciprocal social ties with their sawi, and often providing financial and personal support. However, the support has been criticized as a mechanism that creates a poverty trap. Punggawa pay sawi low wages and then provide loans to supplement sawi's income. In order to pay off the loans, sawi must sell their catches to their Punggawa at below market value, and they rarely regain their financial autonomy. So this process does not allow for upward mobility and improvement of economic conditions for fishers. And it also can prevent fishers from leaving the system to pursue independent coral reef fishing. So although fish abundance and yields may increase as a result of reef restoration, it's unclear how these changes could affect local people and whether they may even have access to these benefits. The final example reflects on the importance of understanding culture and local environmental values. Do the motivations and values driving a restoration agenda align with the local values and needs of a community? In Indonesia, many marine conservation initiatives have been reoriented to address conservation and food security issues simultaneously. There is a strong assumption inserted into some of these agendas that coral reef species are a universally important dietary staple in this region. However, numerous case studies and empirical reports have shown that consumption and livelihood dependence on pelagic and farmed fish are greater in some coastal and island communities. And this was the case here. Local fishers target specific pelagic species because there's a global demand. However, there is also a local preference. Local people express that pelagic fish have a more desirable taste and smell compared to reef fish. They also express their distaste for reef fish is driven by hygiene reasons. Thus, this food security narrative supporting reef restoration in this context is pulled into question. Does reef restoration here reflect actual concerns of food insecurity in the community, or is it driven by Western preservationist values? So in summary, this case study illustrates how context matters. Local histories, politics, and culture shape outcomes of restoration engagement and needs to be integrated into the design and implementation of projects to ensure equitable outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Jessica, can you just stay on the line a little bit? When people ask, so what is really PKPI of your studies, you pointed 3 things. And I just wanted to ask, how long do we need to study all of those? How long was your fieldwork? Was it 10 years? I mean, I suppose not. But what would you be able to give us kind of like a potential timeline if you can actually do work such as this to have a look into the depth?
I think it really varies, but in my case, I implemented my field work for around 8 months. And I think one factor that's really important when looking at fishing communities is the seasonality of resource dependence and how community dynamics really can change with the season. So it's important to ensure that you're getting an understanding of the community across all seasons.
Thank you very much. Many projects actually spend a year and a half to collect non-existing data. So I think to develop the data 8 months and plus a couple more is quite reasonable. So thank you so much for pointing that out. Okay, thanks, Jessica. Now I'm going to introduce Dr. Leah Fusco. Dr. Fusco is a human geographer who is passionate about energy transitions and climate injustice. Leah is a postdoc at Memorial University, collaborating with Professor Gerald Singh. And so she's really exploring the possibility of environmental impact assessment application to the climate justice, as well as the need to consider the potential use of strategic environmental assessment. I hope I presented you well enough. Leah, please to take it over.
Thanks, Yoshi. Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me here today. So my work broadly looks at offshore energy development and planning, especially the use of environmental assessment and its potential as a way to incorporate equity and justice, particularly climate justice, into decision-making processes. So when oil development projects are proposed and planned for, the issues that are usually focused on are regional. So who will benefit, for instance, through jobs, or what areas or species are most at risk from development. For offshore oil production, these may include impacts on specific species, as well as the widespread environmental and socioeconomic impacts of oil spills. The potential for these types of direct and localized impacts are usually assessed before projects are approved through project-based environmental assessments within the jurisdiction where the project is proposed. So for instance, an environmental assessment was recently completed off the east coast of Canada for an oil production project by Equinor, which you can see on the map on the right here. One of the benefits of an environmental assessment is that built into the concept and international guidance is the importance of some form of consultation with people and communities surrounding the project. Thus, environmental assessment has the potential to enhance procedural equity by involving people in decision-making processes about projects that directly impact them. Greenhouse gas emissions have been getting more attention in environmental assessment recently as a result of the Paris Agreement and other regional and international climate commitments. In Canada, for instance, new impact assessment legislation now requires that assessments consider whether a project will help or hinder the country's ability to meet climate commitments. In the Equinor project, environmental assessment in Canada, this meant that the company included greenhouse gas emissions estimates from regional project activities, including drilling, flaring, production, and marine and helicopter transportation. So this amounted to about 0.04% of Canada's yearly emissions. So it's not much in the global context. However, it's the burning of fossil fuels or the consumption of oil that's contributing most to greenhouse gas emissions and thus climate change around the world. For instance, the downstream emissions for the Hibernia project, which is a project that's currently producing oil offshore Eastern Canada, is about 90% of its total life cycle emissions. So that's 90% that aren't being considered when project decisions are being made regionally. So there's a disconnect between sites of production where decisions are made about whether or how to move forward with the project and sites of consumption where most greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. Assessing only regional emissions makes it easy to ignore or downplay downstream emissions and impacts. From a climate justice and procedural equity perspective, there's also another important disconnect that's happening in how project impacts are assessed, which is between both sites of production and consumption and the sites of climate change impacts. These impacts, while happening everywhere, are not evenly distributed or equally experienced by people and places around the world. Small island developing states, for instance, contribute very little to global greenhouse gas emissions, but are experiencing disproportionate impacts and threats to lives and livelihoods. These places, however, are completely disconnected from the places where decision-making about oil development projects are being made. In other words, the impacts they're experiencing are not incorporated into regional assessments and decisions. So while environmental assessments can potentially, if done well, be a way to enhance procedural equity regionally when it comes to oil development, the most significant effects are felt far from sites of production by people with no capacity to be part of the decision-making processes that will ultimately impact them. So environmental assessment as a tool right now isn't very good at incorporating climate justice or broader procedural equity into planning and decision-making. I'd like to suggest here two ways that climate justice can start to be incorporated into environmental assessment processes for offshore energy projects, so that these assessments better incorporate the interests of and impacts on people in other places who can't participate in regional project planning. First is to incorporate a life cycle analysis of oil produced, including downstream emissions and its impacts, into environmental assessments. This would lead to a more complete analysis of the costs and benefits of projects by including impacts on people and places beyond just the sites of production. The second is to make better use of strategic environmental assessments, which are a type of environmental assessment done before specific projects are even proposed, and are meant to consider and assess the potential impacts of broader programs or policy directions. They offer a way to think through different development alternatives, for instance, pursuing offshore renewables over oil in a region. Thus, strategic assessments could be used to ensure that climate change, its causes, and its uneven impacts are incorporated into decisions and planning in regional spaces at a moment in the development process when decisions can be made that will lead to more climate just futures. Thank you very much, and I'll pass it back to Yoshi.
Thank you, Leah. I'm just trying to put my video on and close. Leah, can you stay there? So I just want to ask, breathing assessment. So strategic environmental assessment. Do you see any like a good example, or is anything currently going on or potential in anywhere? Would you be able to share anything if you know? Or if not, then we just have to start it.
That's a good question. I think there are some good and better examples of considering climate change
Right.
and sort of longer term impacts. I think it's still, in terms of looking at sort of life cycle analysis, not really seeing that yet, but I think there's hints at it in some places. So
Thank you so much. We just wait for your work and the people to come along with your vision. Thanks a lot, Leah.
Thank you.
Okay, so it's been quite a lot of journey so far, and then we're halfway. And can you go to the next slide, please? Cool. Okay, so I wanted to note that all these works have been published, and we can you can just get the information from Ocean Nexus work, and then we're going to dedicate one page to make sure that those publications are on it. But if you actually Google each of the fellows and then doctors' names, and at the Google, as you can see, their publications which their presentation has based on. So if you want to seek for the more details, please either contact them individually or read publications. Now, I'm going to move to another exciting work by Dr. Marleen Schutter. Dr. Marleen Schutter is an environmental social scientist and a political ecologist, and she's currently an Ocean Nexus postdoc at the University of Washington in the World Fish Center in Malaysia, collaborating with Dr. Eddie Allison. Marleen is passionate about the human-nature relationships and how these can be governed in a way that can include a diversity of the worldview and the values. We're really trying to understand the struggle over environmental issues by politicizing environmental governance, and that includes addressing power relations. So Marleen or Dr. Schutter, please take away.
Okay, thanks Yoshi, and thanks for the plug as well. It's appreciated. So hello everyone from Lisbon. I'm actually in Lisbon at the moment. I'm very happy to talk to you today about how considering power dynamics can contribute to advancing equity and justice when planning and implementing blue economy programs. Let me go to the next slide. Right, so my research, as Yoshi has already said, focuses on the relationships between people and the sea. And in particular, I study the values, worldviews, and images of different communities around the world and how these contribute to addressing equity and justice issues in ocean governance, the blue economy, and beyond. One of the pioneers of the blue economy concept, when it was put forward originally by small island states, was the Republic of Seychelles. Seychelles is an island nation in the Western Indian Ocean, and it consists of 115 islands, and its exclusive economic zone is massive. It's 1.3 square kilometers. Seychelles has actually undergone major macroeconomic restructuring in 2008, and this restructuring of the economy meant a reduction in government spending and an increased reliance on non-governmental organizations in marine environmental governance. This restructuring also meant an increased pressure on the main economic pillars, tourism and fishing, to bring in revenue. Seychelles blue economy has garnered a lot of international interest, but there was no overview yet on the prevailing perspectives on the concept from within Seychelles. So our research revealed three distinct perspectives on the concept that were coexisting, different perspectives that were on the blue economy in Seychelles, as expressed by government officials and industry representatives from a range of different sectors. And these three perspectives that emerged was, number one was quite critical about the blue economy in practice, but with potential for change. So this perspective had expressed support of the blue economy in principle, but was more critical of practical implementation. Then there was a second perspective that was pragmatic and accepting of the blue economy concept, and also about the practical implementation. And then there was a third perspective that was labeled idealistic and wanting to go further on social inclusion on that part of the blue economy. So overall, there's a network figure there as well. There's 4 influential organizations in terms of sharing resources and information with other organizations. And that indicates that quite a small number of actors are capable of effectively circulating their perspectives through their connections with others. And that sort of central position in the network is a source of power. But from interviews, there was also a sense emerged as well that not everyone, including those people in the more influential organizations, were entirely happy about the implementation of the blue economy. And that sort of raises the question of what if the most influential actors are actually quite critical, then why are things still moving forward in a way that they are not entirely happy with? I think part of the answer to that question is because there's other forms and dimensions of power that are also involved in sort of establishing a blue economy. There's the international context with certain dominant narratives around the blue economy, and there's also influences from political economy. So some of those issues, they raise some questions that I would like to put forward as procedural key performance indicators. So as Yoshi has also told everyone at the beginning, it's not our intention to give sort of a checklist or numbers that would tell us all how equitable a blue economy is. But some questions I would like to put forward as a way of starting to think about equity, they revolve around precisely that question of power. So I'll first highlight 3 specific examples of how power can play a role across different scales. Firstly, there's the power can be understood as the ability to make decisions about, in this case, a vision and implementation of the blue economy concept. And we saw before as well that it is possible through influence to spread certain blue economy visions within a network. The second dimension of power that we can recognize here is the power to set the agenda and also determine the boundaries of what's actually being discussed. So this can be about certain topics, such as what is part of the blue economy and what's not. We can think about different sectors that are considered part of the blue economy or not. Or it can also be about the type of knowledge that counts and is being used for decision making. And this can also be shaped by historical processes of trust and conflict or distrust in those cases as well. The final dimension of power that I'd like to mention is the power of dominant ideas and narratives. And it's arenas such as the conference we are at now, the UN Ocean Conference, that play an important role in influencing ideas and thoughts as well. So that's definitely a dimension of power to consider. And the starting point for asking ourselves these questions around power dynamics can be to practice reflexivity, or the capability of reorientation and redirection to build up or change different rules, structures, discursive spaces. And this is also something we can all start doing right away. So practice that reflexivity on power relations and how these can have an impact on the dominance of particular forms of knowledge, values, and worldviews. And to put some more precise questions to that is one could be, how might the projected outcome of an intervention be mediated by power dynamics? It's important to open up that black box of sort of input and then result, and ask ourselves what's happening in between. To what extent are knowledge, values, and rights of the most vulnerable people, for example, those that are poor and or marginalized, recognized, represented, and incorporated into design, implementation, and evaluation of the intervention? And another question is, to what extent is our thinking process shaped by dominant patterns of production and consumption? Are we also actually considering radical ideas, or are we already exerting our own power in determining what's sort of up for discussion? Well, the last one I would like to highlight, and I mentioned it just now as well, as a concrete application for this particular conference, how are we here at the UN Ocean Conference influencing discursive spaces elsewhere? And that particularly includes power to set the agenda and to shape ideas and narratives. some of the next steps for my own research is to start looking at the processes of implementation and alignment of blue economy policy with objectives of the wider policy context, and whether there's coherence between those, and also to zoom in on who's included in decision-making processes about that. And part of studying equity in the blue economy is also to follow the money and to see which sectors and geographies are actually receiving blue economy finance. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening to me and for being here. I'm looking forward to the other presentations.
Thank you very much, Marleen. I tend to ask a question but we have a limited time. So let me just promote your work that you've been following financial flows of the blue economy space, which including, I believe, Climate Fund and then others. So, everybody, this is extremely important and a very concrete study to address the power. And I would like to think the money is a power, but unfortunately, some people and many people actually do think so. So, power and decision making, Marleen's work, please, everybody stay tuned, and we're going to highlight it in Ocean Nexus. Marleen, would that be okay?
Yeah, thanks so much.
Great, thank you very much. So I just wanted to warn you, everyone, I'm so sorry, it's going over the time, but it's very important conversation, and I hope everybody's going to stay. We dropped a few people, but let's keep going. So next presentation, please, Leah. Thank you. I'd like to introduce Dr. Annie Yeon-song. Annie is a scholar of international relations, and Annie has been working on, he's currently Ocean Nexus postdoc at the University of Technology, Sydney. So she's done under and collaborating with Professor Kate Berkeley and Mike Feeney. Annie is interested in evolving role of China in ocean governance, and she explores how and why China's policy on maritime resource management is shaping and also being shaped by international politics. And is passionate about studying how non-Western emerging economics are interacting with great powers and how they are shaping the international order, including decision-making on oceans and coastal communities. Annie, please take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Yoshi. My name is Annie Yeon-song, and I will be talking about, I'll be talking about PKPI for promoting procedural equity for implementing maritime investment by looking at China's 21st century maritime Silk Road. This presentation is based on our research publication co-authored with Professor Michael Fabini also at UTS. So what is the 21st century maritime Silk Road? It's the maritime part of the centerpiece of China's foreign policy, Belt and Road Initiative, announced by Xi Jinping in 2013 during his official visit to Kazakhstan. And BRI highlights connectivity in both land and ocean. It has two parts, Silk Road Economic Belt, it's a red line on the left map, and 21st century maritime Silk Road blue line on the left map as well. And this study focuses on ASEAN region where Chinese investments are flowing heavily. We looked at three areas specifically affecting coastal livelihoods across the region: mariculture, marine fisheries, and tourism. For mariculture, cooperation projects include mariculture technology transfer and development, training programs with ASEAN countries led by Yellow Sea Fisheries Research Institute, Chinese Academy of Fisheries Sciences, and other local governments and companies. Similar to mariculture sector, Chinese investment in marine fisheries sectors also involve the fisheries technology cooperation, technology training, and research cooperation on fisheries science and technology and fishing bases and ports. Finally, we have a tourism sector. In this table, it's a bit small, but if you can enlarge it, hope you'll be able to see this, but this table can give you an idea of the scale of a Chinese investment. As of July 2019, Chinook provincial authorities in Cambodia indicated that Chinese companies owned 90% of Chinookville businesses, including hotel, restaurants, and gambling dens. So as we study these sectors, we were able to indicate opportunities and challenges to coastal livelihoods in terms of equity context. So in this graph, the vertical axis indicates social equity opportunities and horizontal axis represent economic threats and opportunities. China's maritime investment can offer economic opportunities through mariculture technology transfer only if the transfer training program occurs with the local fishers. But at the same time, there can be income reductions for small-scale fishers as mariculture can restrict their access to fishing ground. Similar to mariculture case, Chinese investment on captured marine fisheries can potentially have a negative impact on small-scale fishers by marginalizing them in the process of technology transfer. Other challenges include the small-scale fishers competing with industrial fishing, leading to displacement from port areas. Also, there can be further income reductions for small-scale fishers through a further reduction in catch. On the other hand, the benefit of these investments in fishing bases include new jobs in fishing industrial parks and development sites. Finally, we have a tourism sector. Economic opportunities can be sought out as there can be more Chinese tourists in the region, but challenges can also follow with these opportunities. For instance, there can be more disparity between locals because renters would face higher living costs and property owners would receive higher income. Finally, there is a serious question about whether economic benefit generated by Chinese investment really trickles down to the locals. So based on these points, I suggest 3 points for policy recommendation. First is to consider the capacity of local governance. Second is to emphasize local engagement. Finally is to protect quality and representation of Chinese investment. And these policy recommendations can be translated into PKPI by considering why or why not and to what extent the preferences and interests of local actors and those who are vulnerable are reflected in policy decisions. And we could measure this PKPI in 2 different ways. First is to measure quantifiable indicators by measuring number of times that public hearings are held and how many local representatives attended meetings or discussions with the policymakers. Second is to measure qualifiable indicators, including having a survey responses on their experiences in policy discussions from local actors and policymakers. And this presentation really shows there, no matter how large the scale that is, we could really conceptualize and think about the ways to create PKPI. Thank you for listening to the presentation. I'll hand it over to Yoshi now.
Thank you very much, Annie. One of the questions that we all have is this a big power and a small local communities? Would it be the possible for the side of the Chinese investment to be interested in how they benefit local communities?
That's a really good question. To answer your question, I would think yes, Chinese policymakers and investors would be interested in what locals would think about Chinese investments, because in the long run,
yes,
they would need local participants to engage with local development, right? So
thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Annie, Dr. Song. Now I'm going to move to the next presentation by Dr. Hekia Bodwitch. Dr. Hekia Bodwitch is a geographer and human geographer, and she examines equity in environmental governance with a focus on indigenous fisheries development. And she's been extensively working with the Maori fisheries in New Zealand and has a deep understanding of community-based equity and justice movement, also in US. And she's a postdoc at Dalhousie University, collaborating with Professor Megan Bailey. Hekia, please start yours.
Thank you, Yoshi. I'm unable to share my video right now because, great, got it.
Got it?
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. Relax, and then we go. Thanks.
Thank you, Yoshi.
Okay.
So I'm going to be looking at PKPI for Indigenous fisheries, incorporating land sea governance to advance justice. The case I'm focusing on is related to Indigenous fishery development in Aotearoa, New Zealand. In New Zealand, Maori own over 30% of New Zealand's commercial fishing rights. However, few Maori are processing or selling fish, processing or selling fish caught by Maori-owned quota. I've worked with Maori fishers, spent time fishing with them on their fishing boats, and worked with Maori tribal leaders to try to understand why this is. What we find is that economic, political, and biophysical factors limit how Maori can use their rights to support Maori fishers. Biophysical factors result in distributional injustices. Economic and political factors, Maori groups have been able to overcome. They face challenges, but they've been able to overcome them. Biophysical factors, which result in these distributional injustices, have been yet unable to be overcome by Maori on their own. They lack the authority, leaders lack the authority to address these issues. So economic, political issues relate to the fact that it's very expensive to develop fishing operations. And as a result, collectively owned Maori fishing rights are more, they will generate more income for the tribe as a whole if they're leased to highest bidding fishing operations than if they're used to facilitate Maori fishers' involvement in the fishery. This has resulted in wealth accumulated at the tribal level, but it has not resulted in the ability of fishers to access fisheries. As a result, tribal leaders have subsidized Maori fishers to facilitate their access to the fishery. And this has been the case for fisheries that cost less money to access, including coastal fisheries such as eel. However, as Maori have worked to develop their eel fishing operations, they have faced severe challenges associated with fishery depletion due to the fact that upstream land use practices, primarily for agricultural expansion, have destroyed the habitat of eel fisheries downstream. So why is it in a country that is well regarded for its Indigenous rights initiatives, do we see this distributional injustice, the injustice that we see between the benefits that the dairy industry is getting from resources and water use that is having adverse effects on Indigenous fisheries downstream? Why do these persist? Well, first, this is due to limited coordination between land and sea-based governing initiatives. Those who are charged with regulating for fishery outcomes are not also authorized to govern upstream land use practices. The second reason is because even when Indigenous representatives have the authority to influence how upstream land use practices are permitted, they lack the political authority to advocate against big agricultural interests to advance fishery health. The third reason is because environmental impact assessments do not incorporate fishers' knowledge about fishery outcomes. Environmental impact assessments, in theory, could provide a tool to challenge large-scale lobbying groups from the agricultural sector or other resource using sectors that affect fishery outcomes. But when they do not incorporate fishers' knowledge about fishery outcomes, they've been yet ineffective to do so. Fishers' knowledge is often conveyed over boats, over meals, and is not easily quantifiable by the consultants who are often hired to conduct the environmental impact assessment. So what does this mean for PKPI design implications? Well, first, fisheries will remain at risk when environmental impact assessments do not include fishers' knowledge. Fishers' knowledge of land-sea interactions includes stories. Again, stories that are often told on boats, over dinner, in contexts where the folks who are meeting in political decision-making forums are unlikely to regularly access. So what does this mean for actions going forward? That we need to be meeting with fishers to conduct environmental impact assessments of upstream development. And for more information on the Maori fisheries development case, please see a recent article in World Development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hekia. Hekia, you actually went through, you engaged with the fisheries, with the communities. I should ask what you are catching, but I just wanted to promote your study. So you have this article on the world development, which can you actually put on the chat so the people who's participating in the audience can also read your stuff because it has a more depth in it. And thank you so much, Hekia, for your presentation and for your field work continuously. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So we're going for the next presentation. And I just put on the chat, it's going to be maybe like a 20 minutes over the time, including the panels. So I really appreciate people staying. And I just wanted to thank everyone who's participated in the chat. I don't put the names, but really appreciate it. Thanks a lot for the feedback. So I'm going to pass the floor to Dr. or Professor Annet Pauwelussen. She's an environmental anthropologist or marine anthropologist and who's pretty passionate about critical social theories and really looking into the conservation practice and making room for relational thinking and indigenous ecologies. The Annet did work in her previous field work in Indonesia, addressing this amphibiity with crossing land and sea. But this time she's really looking into her own place in the Netherlands and talk about the different worldviews and epistemologies. So Annet also, she's an assistant professor in Wageningen University. I'm sorry, Annet, please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Yoshi, and good day, everyone from the Netherlands. Thanks for having me. It's an honor to contribute. Let's see if I can. Yeah, so yeah, indeed, most of my work has revolved around marine conservation. I try to click on the next page. And nomadic people in Indonesia, but here I will actually discuss more recent work I'm engaging in with Ocean Nexus, in which I focus on gender equity in the reef restoration, and in which I look in particular at issues of epistemic justice. And so for this, I use a feminist theoretical lens to not only examine how restoration programs structurally disadvantage women's relations to reefs, but also how dominant conceptions of nature in these programs actually disadvantage by design the knowledge practices as in ways of knowing of women, and but also other subordinate groups, thereby denying them epistemic authority. And so the research that I'm referring, it's actually about corals and oyster reefs, but I will focus here on the oyster part. So over the last years, there has been this surge of restoration projects in Northern Europe around bringing back oyster reefs, which have decimated in the past due to a combination of factors, including disease and overharvesting. And so the focus of these projects and programs has been predominantly on biodiversity value of oyster reefs. And they articulate this goal of restoring a pristine underwater nature or wilderness based on the historical ecological data. And this is also exemplified by this famous yet also contested Olsen's atlas that pictures the places of once abundant oyster reefs currently projected on the future as an ideal natural state to get back to. But what is not pictured in this map is the central role oysters have also played, and in some places still play, in the cultural heritage, identity, and also knowledge practices of coastal communities in this region since pre-Roman times. So in this research, based on qualitative and ethnographic research methods, we, together with Veerle Boekenstein, who's also here, I think, watching, investigate how different oyster restoration approaches use different ways of framing oysters as nature or as culture, and then whose knowledge counts in that, and also the implications this has for including different and gendered ways of relating to oysters. And our initial case study sites are indicated also in the circles in the map, the Solent and Mersey in the UK, and Zeeland and the northern coast of the Netherlands in the Netherlands, with some snapshots also taken during field visits below. So the research draws from feminist theory and the work of also several ocean nexus related researchers and scholars over the last years, including also Sally Lau and Christine Knott. And so feminist theory has long informed the gendered aspects of fisheries, shedding light on the central role of women in seafood harvesting, processing, trade. Yet it has only marginally informed marine science more broadly. And moreover, also in marine science and policy, the gender aspect has often been translated as a more narrow focus on the role of women. And so the risk is that gender equity is then also measured by counting the number of women and without addressing systemic gendered inequities in ocean governance. So in this in fact also misses some crucial contributions of feminist theory to marine science and policy. That is, first, that it can foreground how human reef relations are shaped by patriarchal and colonial systems of oppression, but also it can expose the structural gender biases in how the marine domain is conceptualized and known, and also the epistemic inequity that this produces, disadvantage in, for example, more relational or situated ways of knowing. So in our study sites, there is a very rich historical cultural heritage related to oysters, involving practical knowledge that ties coastal communities to the sea and each other. Women have played a central role in this in the past. For a long time, oyster fisheries and farming, especially in the Netherlands, was one of the few fisheries domains where women wore pants and brought in the bounty. And so the current shift in global shift, I think, in reef conservation from a more hands-off to a more hands-on approach of creating reefs by human intervention provides opportunities for including these human reef interactions and cultural values as inherently part of the reef systems to be restored. And in some cases, in the UK, for example, some restoration projects indeed focus on rehabilitating not just reefs, nature, but also take as a starting point the rehabilitation of the relations that ties humans and reefs together, including also women's practices in that. But in the Netherlands, and this is, I think, also the more dominant approach globally, reef restoration follows a more technocratic approach that prioritizes ecological values and engineering logics to build a nature that in a way then often excludes the cultural values and culinary practices related to oysters, as these are then not considered relevant in the design of wilderness. So a bit of like the broad strokes here. So, but in the way in which reefs are imagined as technocratic projects or relational projects then excludes or includes by design these more embodied, situated, and gendered relations between humans and oysters. Now, finally, to advance gender equity and epistemic justice in a systematic way, it is vital to go beyond just like including or counting women, and to also account for a feminist epistemology that addresses how restoration programs structurally disadvantage women's relations to reefs, but also how dominant masculine conceptions, I would say, of nature in these programs can disadvantage by design the knowledge practices of more subordinate groups. And of course, this all with the aim to include heritage and diverse human-oyster relations in the design of marine nature. So thanks, I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annet. As being part of the dominant masculine inequality, I really appreciate your presentation sincerely. And I also wanted to emphasize the UNSLE Lao has been working on this sort of like an overview of how we're going to approach for the gender in the ocean. And I'm looking forward to sharing everyone your gender in the ocean report. So thanks a lot, Annet. And now I'm going to move to Dr. Rebeca de Buen Kalman. Rebeca is equity-focused environmental policy researcher, and her current work is to focus on integrating equity into practical decision-making tools. So she's actually giving us the policy analysis, introduction to the policy analysis tool that Nexus is developing together, or mainly led by Dr. Grant Broom, Rebeca de Buen Kalman, and Yulan, couple PhD students at Evans School of Policy and Public Policy and Governance at University of Washington. So Rebeca, give us an overview. Thank you very much, Rebeca. Take it away, please.
Hi, Yoshi. Thank you for the kind introduction. Can you see me? I think my video is on now. Okay. So today I'm going to talk briefly about the work we're doing at Ocean Nexus to incorporate and operationalize equity in applied policy analysis. Policy analysis is a tool commonly used in applied context to guide decision-making, but policy researchers are often unfamiliar with this framework. So the work we're doing is to make this practical decision-making tool more visible in academic spaces to bridge the gap in between research and practice. So policy analysis typically follows the following process. This is a framework used to systematically first define a policy problem and then compare policy solutions to reveal trade-offs between different courses of action. So policy analysis typically starts with a problem definition where you identify root causes and symptoms of the problem at hand. Then the analyst will look at the context and the institutional framework for various reasons, the main one being to identify a decision maker who has leverage over the problem as you've defined it. Then you proceed to identify policy options that you will consider in the analysis and criteria on which you will compare them. The analysis stage consists of evaluating the policy options on each of the criteria to finally identify trade-offs, which is the main goal of policy analysis. And usually policy analysis won't give you a favorite policy. Deciding between them will ultimately depend on the priorities and values of the decision-making, of the decision maker. So how does traditional policy analysis differ from one where we center equity? Traditional policy analysis is grounded in neoclassic economic tradition and rarely includes equity as a first order criterion. So traditional policy analysis typically includes criteria that are more practical, such as the ones listed here: effectiveness, cost, timeline, administrative complexity, among others. On the other hand, assessing equity and the equity implications of public policy requires an analysis of power and social structures relative to the context of the public problem at hand. So this starts with embedding equity as a multidimensional and core criteria of policy analysis. And equity should and also be centered in the design of policy options. So equity's centered criteria will include a combination of criteria like those listed here: distributive equity, intergenerational equity, participatory equity, sovereignty recognition, and there are others. And including equity criteria can then help reveal equity trade-offs between policy options being considered. So just to give an example of how we do this. So we assign scores to our assessments of equity to reflect the relative variation from one policy to the next, rather than attempt to quantify an inherently unquantifiable construct. So for example, for distributive equity here, we would study the distribution of costs and benefits. If the costs are borne by the economically powerful and the benefits flow to the less powerful or typically disenfranchised, we would consider this policy to score very high on a scale of distributive equity. If the benefits flow to the economically powerful and costs are experienced by the less powerful or typically disenfranchised, we would consider this policy to score very low on a scale of distributive equity. And in the middle is this neutral option, which is largely hypothetical because policy typically redistributes costs and benefits. And similarly, we can do this for other dimensions of equity, such as intergenerational equity, where we assess the distribution of benefits and costs between present and future generations. And this type of evaluation can be done across various dimensions of equity in a given policy analysis, where the analyst will include the equity dimensions that are most important to the problem at hand and are usually context specific, and how to evaluate each of these levels, or how a policy option falls on each of these levels, is context specific. Here's a quick example that I don't really have time to develop fully, but the main thing I want to show is the value of including a set of equity criteria in a policy analysis. In this example that we have developed of a policy analysis to address the problem of marine litter in Italy. So a policy analysis at the end sort of looks like this, where each of these cells is the evaluation of a policy option, which are these columns, with on each of these criteria, which are these row values here. And usually each of these would have a number or a value that's the result of extensive research and iterative evaluation. Right now here, they're just color coded to keep it simple. But I would like to highlight two of the policy options that we assessed here. One is a phased-in ban of targeted plastics, which is the most effective at reducing leakage, which is our main effectiveness criteria, can be implemented at a moderate cost, but the most effective policy of those analyzed performs lowest on distributional and procedural equity, which are two of the equity criteria we included in this analysis. And then we have another policy that we evaluated, which is a grants program for cities to implement plastic reduction programs, which is a lot lower at reducing leakage. Costs has a similar sort of in the same order of magnitude of cost of the plastic ban, but performs highest across all equity metrics. So in this specific example, there's a trade-off between the equity criteria we assessed and effectiveness. And this is the type of thing that we seek to reveal through a policy analysis that includes equity as a criteria. So there are many current calls to incorporate equity as a multidimensional concept in ocean policy. And we argue that this will not be possible without a discussion and a roadmap on how to measure equity in applied settings. Therefore, we're suggesting that policy analysis is a place where calls for equity can be realized in practice, and we propose some ideas on how to incorporate equity into this framework, acknowledging that equity is context specific. Incorporating equity requires assessing existing power structures relative to the problem, and making equity an explicit criteria in policy analysis can reveal trade-offs that would otherwise be present but not acknowledged. And finally, omitting equity risks further entrenching social inequity by failing to explicitly acknowledge the unequal landscape in which policy solutions will be applied. So that's all for now on my part. Thank you so much. I'll pass it back to Yoshi.
Thank you very much, Rebeca. I just wanted to, I really appreciate the continuous work of Evans, public policy and governance, who's very strong collaborator and with also Nexus and And I'm looking forward to working with you. And everybody wanted to know about the policy analysis. We keep on having policy report published from the Nexus. And so if you're engaging with the Nexus conversation through the network and the newsletter, you will actually be informed about this. Thanks a lot, Rebecca.
Thank
So
you
we're
so
going
much.
for we're going for the last presentation, and I'm going to go for the panel. I'm sorry about it. I'm introducing Dr. Gerald Singh, who is the Deputy Science Director of the Ocean Nexus, and he's the Assistant Professor of the Memorial University. He's in a transition now, but and he also published his co-benefit chart 2017, which is quite popular, but now he's actually incorporating co-benefit together with this new things, PKPI. Gerald, take it away, please.
Thank you, Yoshi. Very kind. And thanks for everyone for staying. I know it's going a little bit over time, but I hope it's worth it for everyone. So I'm going to be talking about procedural key performance indicators for ocean equity towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And really the idea is developing an assessment framework to apply PKPI to SDG implementation. So I'll talk about some of our early thoughts around that. So a quick kind of recap for a lot of what we heard. I can kind of distill into a few points here as it pertains to PKPI. So first is that equity really should not be only assessed at the end of a project. Equity considerations and equity consequences really come about throughout the project, hence the procedural aspect of it. And this has, as we reflect on other modes of measuring equity, most standard measures of equity are really symptomatic of inequity and do not address causes. We really want PKPI to address what are the causes, what are the systemic impacts that lead to inequities. The other is that equity is path dependent, again, thinking about the procedural lens. So equity outcomes often depend on who makes decisions and how fair the process is. So you really need to think about equity throughout the process of any project or any policy. So for example, here, marine spatial planning allocation, it's often a result of who's part of the process to begin with. So we really need to think about from the beginning to end of a project or policy. So in order to think about how we began thinking about the PKPI and how to formulate it, it kind of stems from this result when a number of people from Ocean Nexus and what was the previous iteration, the Nereus program, put together an analysis, a comprehensive analysis of how SDG 14 and ocean sustainability consequences had these ripple effects, these co-benefits across all the other SDG areas. So here's a chart that we revealed at the 2017 UN Ocean Conference, showing what the consequences were for addressing SDG 14 targets and impacts, co-benefits, positive impacts across the other SDGs. So the size of the bubbles here corresponds with the proportion of targets within each SDG. So you see a lot of positives. There's a lot of good things that come out from addressing ocean sustainable development issues. However, this was a bit of a rosy lens because we also have, you can also look at it from a broader set of the data. And so this comes from a publication associated with the co-benefits work, showing not just co-benefits, which you see in shades of blue on this chart on these pie graphs, but also some examples of trade-offs. And so there are some instances where you can actually have progress in ocean development that have negative consequences across the SDGs. And it's really important to point out that wherever we see these potential trade-offs, they're in areas that are really important for equity considerations, addressing poverty, addressing livelihoods, around SDG 10, which is all about reduced inequalities and issues of peace and justice. And so it's really, really important to develop interventions and development plans that try to mitigate and forestall trade-offs with these equity dimensions and to boost potential co-benefits. So that's really a lot of the thinking behind PKPI. And so a lot of members in the Ocean Nexus group start thinking about, okay, how do we just start to design processes that can help again, forestall some of the trade-offs and take advantage of co-benefits. And it made us think about, okay, what's often done for planning for these kinds of projects, these kind of science-based projects. And so this is a quick linear model of how sustainable development is often kind of pursued typically. So there's a lot of exploration and prediction that occurs with regards to how a project will perform. They produce a lot of different data sets and other scientific outputs, and there's training associated with running an initiative, and it's the focus is often there, and then there's kind of an assumed consequence for global societal outcomes. However, this kind of model often does leave people behind. It often benefits those who already benefit, and we put together a different kind of model. A broad kind of process for planning and evaluating interventions in the ocean development space that centers ocean-dependent people. So the first thing you do is you co-design the project with ocean-dependent people, and from there you understand the context that they're living in, the problems they're facing, and how the potential program can alleviate or problems and promote their interests before you getting into actually proposing, implementing, and doing the kind of science basis for sustainable development. And you want to assess them based on SDG outcomes. So we put this out. It's starting to get some attention, but we're very interested in how do you operationalize this. And so this is where PKPI really comes in, to try to think about how do you operationalize these steps. And so what we're planning to do and what we're starting to develop is that operationalization. And so these first couple of steps here for assessing priorities and problems and doing the understanding of context is really, this first step is understanding sociological context in a co-developed space. And so I just thinking back to all of our fellows' presentations, a lot of it was focused here, understanding what's the context, understanding why equity is concerned in what ways. It's only from there that you start planning out the project or the policy. And so the way we're thinking about it, there's a design phase, an implementation phase, and that's where we're corresponding with number 3 on our left-hand side. And it follows that we assess outcomes from there. So there's a procedural, stepwise process here. And how do we do this? Well, we're beginning to develop kind of a systematic lens for thinking about equity across all these different stages of a project or policy, from design through outcomes. We want to be systematic without being prescriptive. So the real intent is for the equity PKPI measures to come through the co-design space, but we want to give a systematic lens, understanding that some projects and policies will focus more on some areas and some on others. And of course, every good framework should have feedback. What you learn at the outcome should inform how you design and implement later on. So we want to have this kind of feedback throughout. So this is our current working model. We're very, very excited to partner up with more organizations through kind of our ongoing and emerging partnerships, when we really want to help continue develop this framework, with the focus really being on to plan, assess, and diagnose equity. And just to quickly close, I'll bring up that the purpose of this, you heard a lot of talks at kind of the case study level, but we do want it to be scalable. So for example, thinking about the SDG 14 voluntary commitments, we've begun to look at equity considerations across all the 1,600 voluntary commitments that have been promoted for SDG 14, and started to collect some data as it associates with equity. And so on the left-hand side, you see a chart here. This is the number of voluntary commitments that address all of these different SDG areas, everything from life below water to reduced inequalities at the bottom. These are the number of voluntary commitments that specifically name vulnerable groups. they have a specific consideration for vulnerable groups, or the number of projects within each that addresses vulnerable groups. So, for example, if you see at the very, very bottom, the reduced inequalities, there's roughly about 85 voluntary commitments that address reduced inequalities, but only 28 of them specifically name vulnerable groups. So it leads us to have some questions about how equity is being planned in these voluntary commitments, and we hope that PKPI setting can help up that number, help really increase focus on vulnerable groups. On the right-hand side, this is a graph showing the number of projects led by different types of agencies, everything from governments down. One thing you notice is that most voluntary commitments are led by governments, NGOs, mostly environmental NGOs, private sector, and UN agencies. Very few are led by civil society and through partnerships. And we noticed that these two are the kinds of leading organizations that often have ocean-dependent groups, ocean-dependent communities as actually leaders in these kinds of projects. So again, it opens up some questions about the kind of procedural equity considerations. We hope to dig in more. Finally, we did some topic analysis. This is on the different voluntary commitments that looks specifically at SDG 1 on poverty, SDG 2 on hunger, SDG 5 on gender equality, and SDG 10 on reducing inequalities. And we want to look to see what are the main topics that are discussed. They're supposed to be addressing these different SDGs, but a lot of the focus of these voluntary commitments are really similar. You'll notice almost the same kind of word clouds here. And so most of the time, the focus is on fisheries management and environmental outcomes. Yet the focus is supposed to be on these different SDG endpoints. And so it really highlights what Yoshi brought up right at the beginning on the missing link and the need for kind of specific SDG or specific equity considerations through these so that proper planning and monitoring can be done through these kinds of projects. So I'll close with that. Thank you all, everyone, for taking part in this.
Thank you very much, Gerald. I'm so sorry I shouted my son and then it went into the recording. Hope you don't mind.
No problem.
Thanks for the brilliant work. So for the sake of the time, thanks, Gerald. I'm going to introduce three panels. Andrés Pompano, who's the Deputy Director of Alliance of Small Island State, and also Dr. Cindy Scott, who's the Center Director of oh my God. Hang on. I'm sorry. I just blanked.
It's okay. The School for Field Studies.
Thank you very much. It's my handwriting over here. And, sorry, it's in the Boca de Toro in Panama. And also CEO Maria Espinoza Romina, who is the CEO of Comunidad y Biodiversidad in Mexico. Thank God I got it okay. I just wanted to ask three of you, if you can come into the camera. Okay, I just wanted you, seeking for the remark from you all, what you think about it, what you have heard so far for the PKPI, perhaps like a couple of minutes each to start with, please. Shall I ask Maria?
Thank you, Yoshi, and thank you for the invitation. I think it's very impressive the work that you have been doing with the PKPI, and I like to see the how it can be addressed from different disciplines, and also the good opportunities to integrate other types of data. I like to see this opens the door for new knowledge, because we are so traditional sometimes in each discipline with the data we collect to understand complex problems, wicked problems. And I was thinking that in the context of the blue economy, the PKPI is really useful because there is a trend to integrate these vulnerable groups and invisible voices, and through this there is a way to raise these issues and to raise these groups. So I think that is very important. And I also like the way you are presenting it, that is, you know, at the front, at the beginning, as a part of the process rather than as an outcome, because we don't want to keep saying like, oops, I did it again, you know, like it's not what we want. We need to put it at the core, at the front, and then so this information can guide action and policy. I also think that if we do it, we need to be careful because this is also very sensitive information, and at least in the context of coastal communities where COBI works in, this can lead to conflict also, you know. So we need to be very careful on this, and I think that one way to address this piece is what you mentioned, through the engagement of scientists with practitioners, so we can actually integrate research to action for sustainability and all that. So I know that we are constrained in terms of time, so I leave it there, and congratulations, and happy to know more about this work. And also I raise my hand to join the group if you are looking for more partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very important for the safety of the community if we're going to do such a scientific work. I'm going to pass it to Angelique. Can we hear from you?
Hi, everyone. It's quite late in Lisbon, but I'm glad we kept a good, healthy group of people still attending. So everyone, really, thank you very much for your presentation. So very similar to what Maria has said, I really like the idea of having this all at the very beginning, with a view with sort of an eye on practice as well as academia. In my experience, equity is very much, or very often, an afterthought, or it's something that's thought to be too complicated to delve into, or even worse, too uncomfortable to talk about. And so this really helps us get rid of such excuses, and taking it from a design at the design stage is really important, rather than it being an afterthought where you think, oh, we should have measured this as an outcome. So I'd like to really thank the fellows who have made the presentations and provided us with very specific context. I think that has been very, very helpful. I also commend the approach of not being overly prescriptive. I think there's something there about not providing this checklist. Although I must admit, in a practitioner's world, sometimes the easy way is preferred, and there may be a desire for that box ticking exercise. So when we talk about ensuring quality of local engagement, or thinking about gender equity beyond just counting the number of women who have attended the workshop, it does mean a lot more work needs to go into the thinking. And that started to get me to think about, yes, we have the framework. Yes, but then what next? Do the departments who are doing this work actually need capacity to be able to move to the next stage? And perhaps that's something to think about going forward, being not only instructive, but also really helping to operationalize it. I'm someone who looks at regulatory frameworks and the law. And of course, the law oftentimes only tells you have a set number of public meetings, for example, but it does not go into the actual process of stakeholder engagement. It makes me start to think, is the law a good place to legislate for equity considerations? I haven't got the answer for you, but it's certainly something this conversation has triggered my mind to. But finally, perhaps a word of caution as somebody who works with small island developing states. This creates another layer of complexity as well. Maria touched about the sensitivity. It's also important to appreciate that a lot of research is being done outside of SIDS. Oftentimes about SIDS and not necessarily including SIDS scholars. And this raises a question on positionality of the researchers themselves, who then expect that policymakers from SIDS will use their knowledge to inform policy. So it's very important that we continue to engage SIDS professionals, scholars, practitioners in this process. But on the whole, very well done, team. And this has been really inspiring and really good food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angelique. Those are very important topics that we need to think about it. And Maria, Angelique, before we're going to Jacinda, I just wanted to say the Nexus is really trying to build up this research platform. So we are hoping to, policy analysis is one way. We are hoping to do much more sort of like a data collection for the decision makers. That's another pursuit we're doing. Together with our researchers, we're trying to find the best way to just collaborate and build a partnership. And you know, the collaborators you do and also Ocean Voice and Ocean Have and other programs really help us. We're just really small, but we're hoping to expand. Really thank you for the feed of the thoughts. So Cinda, can I just hear your comment? Hi.
Yes, first and foremost, thank you very much for the invitation, and congratulations to all of the fellows who presented today. It's an honor to be here and to share my thoughts on the PKPIs. I have so many notes and comments, but I think ultimately when I think about this, I see the diversity of inequity across all scales, all projects, and that's pretty startling, but then it's also not surprising. And I think we have to go back and look at that basic question is, how is nature defined and for whom? And who got to do that at the start, and why are we still perpetuating these structures across different seascapes, right? So I think I do see a great need for PKPIs. I am curious to see how it will progress and be useful for a practitioner like me in the field in Panama to be able to, at the start, figure out, am I perpetuating inequities that I have been indoctrinated to? And how do I stop doing that? And how do I promote this in a way that other people will be more aware of how they're perhaps perpetuating inequities in their own work? And how do we begin to conceptualize this so that we can, I guess, share it across all these different kinds of inequities, because they're not all the same. And maybe they don't all have the same base and reason for existing either. So that also has to be looked at. And I find this really fascinating. And I think it is absolutely necessary to have a means to be able to understand these inequities more readily. But I question, how do we actually do that when we have such a diversity of inequities? And I guess that's my only comment, but I definitely appreciate all the work around the world that's being done to understand this better, as I think it's been ignored for too long. It's been completely rejected and outright in most cases to even look at equity, because God forbid we talk about racism, God forbid we talk about classism, gender issues, and these are at the core of the persistence of inequities and these systemic issues that are occurring and greatly impacting the way in which we interact with the ocean. So those are my comments, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, three of you. Maybe I think we're just going to wrap up here, if that's okay, because that was a huge bit of thought for us to think about it, and hoping to think about it together with you all. I think we're going to add another complexity for some of the people, and then that's definitely true. We need to make it much more operational and useful for the practitioners. And finally, we really have to think about, okay, how are we going to accommodate all the different diversity of inequity and inequities? But what we really wanted to kind of like consider is, you know, there's things that we need to talk, and because of many reasons we don't. And that also perpetuate what we are struggling about or implementation, management, monitoring, but really to just reach out to the people or the ocean environment we really need to address. And so we just wanted to bring back the conversation and then start working from there. Otherwise, I don't think there's no way. There's no other way to do it. So, and also we're just tackling with a lot of human relationship, and then that can be solved or that can be negotiated in some ways, potentially better than how we actually change the environment immediately. So that's the conversation I'm going to bring it in. I just wanted to thank everyone who participated this today. And I really wanted to thank all the audience who stayed here. Please keep in touch with us, and thank you very much. And so from here, I just, to be a chair, can I just indulge myself to make a short comment? I have a former student in who I taught in UK and who's at the moment in Ukraine. So I really wanted to acknowledge not just only Ukraine, everywhere in the world who's just trying to survive through the human security conflict. And I would like to support their effort as much as condemning those who are actually threatening those people's human security. And that was my individual comment, nothing to do with the Nexus, but just couldn't help it. So thank you very much, everyone. And hope to keep it engaged. Thanks. Cinda, thank you. Anjali.